The email arrived during the lowest point of my professional life. 6 months unemployed after being laid off from a sports psychology research position at a major university, I had just been rejected for another job that seemed perfect for my qualification. My savings were dwindling and desperation was setting in. Personal assistant position, professional athlete, Houston area, sports psychology, background, preferred. I nearly dismissed it as another dead end, but something made me open it. The job description was vague but intriguing. A high-profile athlete seeking a personal assistant with background in sports psychology to help manage day-to-day operations, coordinate with training staff, and provide general support for mental performance initiatives. The position required signing extensive non-disclosure agreements before the athlete's identity would be revealed. 3 interviews later, each more intense than the last, I found myself signing paperwork in a sterile conference at a management agency in downtown. Only then did the representative slide a folder across the table containing details about my potential employer, Simone Biles, the most decorated gymnast in history. Ms. Biles values her privacy, the representative. This position requires absolute discretion. You'll be working in her home, coordinating various aspects of her schedule, and supporting certain mental performance protocols her team established. I tried to maintain a professional demeanor despite my Simone Biles, the gymnast who had redefined what was physically possible in her sport, who had won more world championship medals than any gymnast ever, who had become synonymous with both athletic excellence and the growing conversation around mental health in sports after her withdrawal from events at the Tokyo Olympics. One final thing, the representative added. Ms. Biles has requested that candidates have no strong preconceived notions about her based on media coverage. She wants someone who will see her as she is, not as she's been portrayed. Can you do that? I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure if that was possible. Like most of the world, I had followed her career. The gravity-defying skills named after her, the Olympic triumph, the stunning decision to withdraw from competition in Tokyo to protect her mental health, and her triumphant return. 2 days later, I drove through the gates of a beautiful but not ostentatious home in the suburbs of Houston, Texas. As I parked my car, I reminded myself that regardless of her fame, this was fundamentally a job, one I desperately needed and was qualified. I would be professional, efficient, and discreet. What I couldn't have known then was that over the next year, I would witness something far more extraordinary than athletic greatness. Behind the closed doors of her private life, Simone Biles was engaged in a daily practice of courage that had nothing to do with gymnastics and everything to do with reclaiming her humanity from a world determined to transform her into something both more and less than human. And it would completely transform how I understood the nature of fear, courage, and what it means to be truly exceptional. Chapter 2. First Impression. My first day began at 7 a.m. sharp. I was greeted at the door by Cecile, Simone's longtime manager, who had been briefly overseeing the duties I would now assume. The house was beautiful, but not extravagant, thoughtfully designed, bright spaces with high ceilings, modern furnishing, and surprisingly few visible indication that it belonged to one of the most accomplished athletes on the planet. No prominent display of medals or trophies, no larger-than-life photos of Olympic moments. Instead, the walls featured abstract art, family photos, and what appeared to be inspirational quotes written in elegant calligraphy. Simone will be back from morning training at 11:30, Cecile explained as she showed me around. She'll have a recovery session, lunch, and then she'd like to meet with you to go over schedules and protocol. The morning was spent learning systems, security procedures, scheduling software, contact protocols for Simone's extensive support team, dietary requirements, and household operations. Everything was meticulously organized, reflecting a life where structure and precision weren't just professional requirements, but ingrained values. At precisely 11:27 a.m., I heard the garage door open. Moments later, Simone Biles walked in, accompanied by her athletic trainer. She was smaller than she appeared on television, a reminder of how her tremendous power had always created the illusion of greater size. She wore training attire, hair pulled back, carrying a large water bottle and looking physically tired but mentally alert. After a brief introduction, she excused herself for her recovery, leaving me with the impression of someone efficient, professional, and more reserved than her public persona suggested. There was none of the bubbly, smiling personality that characterized her media appearance, just focused intensity and the watchful gaze of someone assessing a new variable in her carefully calibrated environment. I spent the next hour reviewing schedules with Cecile, noting the precision with which Simone's days were structured: training session, recovery protocol, media obligation, sponsor requirement, and carefully protected. Everything was allocated specific blocks with clear boundaries between professional obligation and private life. At 1:15 p.m., Following her lunch and recovery session, Simone joined me in her home office, a bright room with large windows overlooking a small garden. Dressed now in casual clothes, hair down, she seemed more relaxed, but still carried an undercurrent of intensity that never fully did. "Thank you for joining she began, her tone friendly but direct. "Cecile says your background in sports psychology will be valuable. What hasn't she told you that you need to know?" The directness of the question caught me off guard, but I appreciated it. "Probably the details of what mental performance support you're looking for, beyond basic scheduling and coordination." She nodded, seeming to appreciate my straightforward response. "I have specific mental practice that are as important as my physical training. Some happen at the gym with my performance, but many happen here. Your role includes helping maintain the environment needed for those practices and coordinating with various specialists to support them." She opened a folder containing what appeared to be a mental training, structured exercises for visualization, cognitive process, emotional regulation, and something called fear inventory session. "After Tokyo," she continued, referencing her withdrawal from Olympic events due to mental health concerns, "I rebuilt my relationship with gymnastics and with fear itself. That work doesn't stop when I leave the gym. It's a daily practice, and maintaining its structure is critical." For the next hour, Simone walked me through my responsibilities with remarkable clarity and precision. This wasn't a celebrity delegating to household staff. This was a high-performance professional explaining technical requirements to a specialist. She described specific routines, environmental needs, scheduling priorities, and communication protocols with her integrated support team. Most striking was her explanation of protected spaces and times, periods completely insulated from external demands, notifications, or interruption. These weren't simply rest periods, but seemed to serve specific psychological purposes in her daily routine. "The world gets enough of me," she explained. "These boundaries aren't luxury, they're necessity. My team understands this isn't about convenience, it's about sustainability." As our meeting concluded, Simone fixed me with a direct gaze that was both assessing and honest. "One more thing. You know who the public thinks I am. You've seen the commercials, the interviews, the Instagram posts. That's part of me, but it's also a necessary performance. Here, in this house, I need to exist without performing. Your discretion isn't just professional, it's personal. Do you understand?" I nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. This wasn't merely about privacy or avoiding tabloid exposure. It was about creating a sanctuary where she could temporarily set down the immense psychological burden of being Simone Biles in the public consciousness. As she left for an afternoon training session, I reflected on this first impression, so different from the perpetually smiling, seemingly carefree athlete portrayed in media. The Simone Biles I had just met was focused, precise, articulate about her need, and carrying an awareness of the psychological complexity of her position that belied the simplified narrative about her life and career. What I couldn't yet understand was that I had only glimpsed the surface of that complexity. In the coming months, I would witness something far more profound than athletic greatness. A daily confrontation with fear that had nothing to do with the difficulty of gymnastic skills and everything to do with the courage required to remain fully human under the weight extraordinary. Chapter The Morning Protocol. By my third week working in household, I had settled into the operational rhythm of daily responsibility. My primary functions included coordinating schedules between training staff, managing household logistics, handling certain correspondence, and supporting various aspects of Simone's mental performance practice. It was this last element that provided my first meaningful insight into how Simone confronted fear, not just as an Olympic gymnast performing dangerous skills, but as a human being navigating extraordinary psychological pressures. The revelation came through what household staff simply called the morning protocol, a sequence of practice Simone completed before each training. While her physical warm-up happened at the gym, this mental preparation process occurred at home, typically beginning at 5:15 a.m. in a dedicated room adjacent to her bedroom. My involvement was peripheral, ensuring the space was prepared according to specific requirement, that certain materials were available, and that no interruptions occurred during the designated time. Initially, I had no direct observation of what transpired during these morning sessions. That changed during my fourth week when a technical issue with the lighting in the preparation room required my presence shortly after Simone had begun her protocol. After resolving the issue, I apologized for the interruption and turned to, "Since you're already here," Simone said unexpectedly, "you might as well understand what this is about. It might help you see why certain aspects of the schedule and environment are non-negotiable." She gestured to a chair at what I observed over the next transformed understanding of what mental preparation meant for performing at her level. The room was minimally furnished, cushioned floor mats, a small desk with a journal, a tablet, and what appeared to be biofeedback equipment. On the walls were not motivational quotes or images of victory, but large sheets of paper with handwritten notes in Simone's distinctive script. Looking closer, I realized they were fear in systematic analyses of specific fears categorized by type, intensity, and response. These weren't primarily fears about gymnastics, though some related to training and competition. They included fears about identity, purpose, relationships, legacy, autonomy, and public perception. Each was dissected with remarkable objectivity, not as emotions to be eliminated, but as data to be understood. Simone noticed my attention on these documents. After Tokyo, I had to develop a different relationship with fear, she explained. Not trying to conquer it or push through it, that approach nearly broke me. I needed to get granular, specific about exactly what fears were present and what purpose they might be serving. Described how this catalogue of fears had evolved into a daily practice of identification and process, acknowledging each fear, that locating it physically, examining its thought pattern, and developing response to fear to dominate. People think courage is about connecting all senses to her fingertips that I recognize as heart rate variable. That's not it at all. Courage is about developing a sophisticated relationship with fear, understanding it as information rather than an enemy. For the next 20 minutes, I observed as Simone engaged in what she called intentional exposure, systematically bringing attention to specific fears while monitoring her physiological response and practicing regulation. This wasn't relaxation or positive thinking. It was a disciplined engagement with discomfort, allowing fear to be present while practicing the capacity to function effectively alongside it. Most revealing was the journal component that followed. Rather than focusing solely on performance-related thoughts, Simone documented her observations about how specific fears manifest, what triggered them, how they evolved during the exposure practice, and what insights emerged about their underlying nature. The journaling isn't just record explained, it's about developing the witness, the part of observed fear, without becoming consumed. That perspective doesn't come natural. It's cultivated through consistent practice. As she completed her protocol with a brief meditation, I was struck by the sophistication of this approach, far beyond the sports psychology technique I had studied or implemented in university settings. This wasn't generic mental toughness training or visualization. It was a personalized practice developed through intense self-study and professional guidance. In the weeks that followed, my appreciation for the morning protocol deepened as I observed its effects. On days when schedule disruptions prevented its full completion, the impact was subtle but noticeable. A slightly different quality to Simone's energy, a marginally higher tension in her communication, a less fluid transition between various demands. Most revealing was a conversation I overheard between Simone and her performance psychologist during their weekly session in the home office. I was delivering some requested materials when I caught a fragment that illuminated the purpose behind the practice. The protocol isn't about manipulating my mental state to perform better, Simone was explaining. It's about creating internal conditions where I can choose my response rather than being driven by fear-based reactivity. Some days that means pushing through. Other days it might mean pulling back. The goal is choice, not control. This perspective challenged everything I had been taught about elite athletic psychology, which typically emphasized control, consistency, and pushing beyond limitation. Simone was describing something more nuanced, a relationship with fear based on understanding and wise response rather than dominance or suppression. By my second month in the household, I understood that the morning protocol wasn't peripheral to Simone's training. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. The extraordinary physical feats that had redefined gymnastics weren't accomplished by conquering fear, but by developing a sophisticated relationship with it, one that required as much daily discipline as any physical training element. And most significantly, this practice extended far beyond athletic performance. The fears being processed weren't limited to those related to difficult skills or competitive pressure. They included the complex psychological challenges of existing as Simone Biles in the public consciousness, the weight of representation, the burden of others' projection, the tension between authenticity and expectation. What I was witnessing wasn't just an athlete preparing for competition. It was a human being developing the capacity to live with extraordinary pressure without being deformed by it. The courage I observed wasn't about fearlessness in the face of difficult gymnastics. It was about the daily practice of facing the full complexity of a life that few could understand and even fewer could navigate with integrity. And this, I was beginning to realize, was the side of Simone Biles that remained largely invisible to the world. Not the champion who performed incredible physical feats, but the person engaged in the even more difficult work of remaining fully human under circumstances that constantly threatened to reduce her to a symbol, a projection, or a simplified narrative. Chapter 4. The Twisty. 3 months into my position, an incident occurred that provided deeper insight into Simone's relationship with fear, specifically the phenomenon that had captured worldwide attention during the Tokyo Olympics, the Twisty. The term had entered public consciousness when Simone withdrew from several Olympic events, explaining that she had lost the ability to track her position in the air during twisting element, a potentially life-threatening situation for a gymnast performing skills with multiple flips and twists. While the media had covered this extensively, the ongoing reality of managing this condition remained largely private. My understanding came unexpectedly. I was preparing materials for an afternoon meeting when Simone returned early from training, hours before her scheduled finish time, accompanied by her coach and looking visibly distressed. They proceeded immediately to what staff called the reset room, a space specifically designed for processing difficult training experience. 30 minutes later, her coach emerged and asked me to bring water and to notify Simone's performance psychologist about an air awareness episode. The serious expression and urgency in his voice made clear this wasn't a minor training setback. When Dr. Chen, her performance psychologist, arrived, I helped prepare the space with specific equipment, biofeedback monitors, a visualization platform, and what appeared to be virtual reality. Before leaving them to their session, I overheard a fragment of conversation that illuminated the situation. It happened on the double-double, same pattern as Tokyo, Simone was explaining, her voice steady despite obvious distress. Complete spatial disconnect on the second twist. Managed to land, but knew immediately we needed to implement the protocol. Later that evening, after the household had quieted, Simone unexpectedly joined me in the kitchen, where I was completing some organizational work. She seemed calmer, but carried a pensive energy. "You're probably wondering what happened," she said, pouring herself tea. "Only to the extent it affects schedule," I replied, trying to maintain professional boundaries. She smiled slightly at the diplomatic response. "It affects more than scheduling. The Twisties aren't a one-time event that happened in Tokyo. They're something I manage continuously. Today was a significant episode. We'll need to adjust tomorrow's plans according to the response protocol." When I acknowledged my limited understanding of the condition, Simone surprised me with her candor. "Imagine suddenly not knowing which way is up when you're flipping through the air," explained. "Skills that have been automatic for years become terrifying because your brain and body disconnect. The fear isn't about getting hurt, though that's real too. It's about completely losing trust in the most fundamental aspects of how you understand movement." She described how she had developed specific protocols for responding to, not fighting against them or pushing through, but systematically rebuilding the neural pathways and trust required for safe performance. This wasn't a matter of mental toughness, but of neurological calibration and psychological process. Before Tokyo, I had no framework for handling. The only message in gymnastics was always push through, ignore fear, fight harder. That approach nearly broke me and could have resulted in catastrophic injury. What she had developed since, with her integrated team of coaches, psychologists, and neurological specialists, was a sophisticated system for responding to these episodes with what she called respect and patience rather than force and denial. Over the following weeks, I observed this system in action as Simone responded to the rather than pushing immediately back to difficult skills, her training followed a structured progression, rebuilding basic elements with extensive use of physical supports, specialized feedback systems, and careful attention to the psychological components. Most revealing was a conversation I overheard between Simone and her coach during a home review session. They were analyzing video of training progression when the coach commented on her improved approach. "A year ago, you would have forced your way back to the skill within days and created a longer setback. A year ago, I was still trying to prove something by how quickly I could overcome fear." Simone replied. "I've learned that respecting, understanding what it's communicating rather than treating it as weakness, actually creates faster and more sustainable progress." This perspective illuminated something fundamental about Simone's evolution, not just as an athlete, but as a person navigating extraordinary pressures. The Tokyo experience hadn't primarily been about learning when to step back from competition. It had been about developing a more sophisticated relationship with fear itself, recognizing it as information rather than obstacle, responder rather than enemy. Most significant was how this approach extended beyond gymnastics. During a subsequent meeting with her performance, I observed how Simone applied the same principles to managing other aspects of her life. The demands of public appearance, the weight of others' expectations, the pressure of constant evaluation. The twisties taught me something that applies everywhere, she explained to the team. When warning signals appear, whether physical or psychological, ignoring them doesn't prove strength. It demonstrates poor listening. Real strength comes from respecting these signals while not being controlled by them. This philosophy directly contradicted the narrative of athletes as warriors conquering fear through sheer will. Simone was describing something more nuanced, the courage to acknowledge fear's validity while maintaining the capacity for wise response rather than reactive avoidance or reckless pushing. 5 months into my role, I understood that the twisties weren't simply a career obstacle that Simone had overcome. They represented a profound turning point in her relationship with fear, one that had transformed not just her approach to gymnastics, but her entire orientation toward pressure, expectation, and performance in all domains of life. What I was witnessing daily wasn't an athlete who had conquered fear. It was something far more impressive, a person who had developed a sophisticated understanding of fear's purpose and a disciplined practice for engaging with it productively. This wasn't the absence of fear, but the presence of a hard-won wisdom about how to live with it authentically. And this perspective began to illuminate what true courage looked like in Simone's life. It wasn't the spectacular physical feats that had made her famous, impressive though they were. Real courage was found in the daily practice of facing fears, physical, psychological, existential, without either denying their reality or allowing them to dictate her choices. This wasn't the simplified courage of heroic narratives. It was the messy, complex courage of remaining fully human under pressures specifically designed to transform her into something both more and less than human. And it required daily practice far from public view. Chapter 5. The Weight of Representation. 6 months into managing Simone's household, I witnessed a dimension of her experience that rarely entered public discussion: the psychological burden of representing multiple communities simultaneously, and the courage required to navigate those. The situation that revealed this burden began innocuous, sorting through requests for Simone's time and attention, a regular part of her responsibility. These typically included media appearances, speaking engagement, sponsor obligations, and various philanthropic opportunities. The volume was staggering, with dozens of requests arriving weekly, despite her management team's filtering effort. What struck me wasn't just the quantity, but the nature of the requests. They weren't merely seeking Simone the gymnast, they wanted Simone the symbol, the black woman who had triumphed in a predominantly white sport, the abuse survivor who had spoken truth to power, the mental health advocate who had prioritized well-being over medals, the record breaker who redefined what was physically possible. Each request, subtly or explicitly, asked her to represent a different constituent, to speak for, stand for, or embody something beyond herself. The cumulative weight of these expectations was made visible one afternoon when Simone reviewed the categorized requests I had prepared. "This is why protected time isn't negotiable," she said, scanning the document. "Every one of these wants a piece not just of my time, but of my identity. They each want me to carry something for someone else." Her tone wasn't resentful, but matter of fact, acknowledging reality rather than complaining about it. When I mentioned that many people would be flattered by such demand for their perspective, her response revealed a deeper understanding of the dynamics at play. "It's not really about my perspective," she explained. "Most of these don't want to hear my complex, messy thoughts. They want me to represent something specific that serves a particular narrative, about race, about mental health, about American excellence, about female empowerment. Each wants a different version of Simone Biles that fits their need." Over the following weeks, I observed how conscious Simone navigated the expectation. She was neither cynically dismissive of representational responsibilities nor naively accepting of every burden placed upon her. Instead, she engaged in careful discernment about which roles she could authentically embrace and which would require performing versions of herself that didn't reflect her real experience. The depth of this struggle became apparent when a major civil rights organization requested her presence at an important event. The invitation framed her as a powerful symbol of Black excellence and resilience against systemic barriers. Simone spent considerable time reflecting on this request, ultimately discussing it with her closest advisors during a meeting I helped coordinate. "I'm deeply honored," she said to the gathered team, "and I understand the importance of representation. But there's a specific narrative here about overcoming racial barriers that doesn't fully align with my actual experience. My challenges in gymnastics weren't primarily about race. They were about abuse in the sport, about mental health pressure, about the specific culture of elite gymnastics. Continued, articulating once rarely captured in public. I am proudly black, and that identity is fundamental to who I am. But if I speak at this event as framed, I'd be tacitly endorsing a storyline about my journey that isn't entirely authentic. I'd be performing a version of Simone Biles that meets external expectation rather than reflects my lived truth. 4. The conversation that followed revealed the sophisticated ethical framework Simone applied to these decisions, weighing community responsibility against personal authenticity, considering the impact of both participation and refusal, and examining her own motivations with remarkable honesty. Most revealing was her comment near the discussion's conclusion. The hardest courage isn't performing difficult skills or competing under pressure. It's disappointing people whose approval and acceptance matter to you, because honoring truth is more important than meeting expectation. This perspective illuminated a form of courage I hadn't previously recognized in Simone's daily life. The courage to disappoint constituencies that viewed her as their representative, to resist the subtle pressure to perform identities that weren't fully authentic to her experience, to insist on the complexity of her humanity despite external demands for simpler narrative. The weight of these expectations extended beyond formal requests to the constant awareness of being watched and interpreted. I observed how carefully Simone considered even casual social media posts, aware that every word and image would be scrutinized, not just for entertainment value, but for what it represented about various aspects of identity and experience she was to embody. The exhausting part isn't the gymnastic, she confided, during a rare moment of direct discussion about these pressures. It's the constant awareness that everything I do carries symbolic weight for someone else. An ordinary bad day becomes black excellence faltering. A normal human limitation becomes mental health advocate failing. A simple personal preference becomes a statement about something larger. This awareness didn't paralyze her action, but required constant navigation, assessing when to embrace representative roles, when to qualify or contextualize them, and when to firmly decline them despite external pressure. Each decision required its own form of courage, not the spectacular courage of athletic feats, but the quieter courage of maintaining personal integrity amid competing demands for who she should be for others. Perhaps most poignant was how Simone created space to exist beyond these representational burdens. Her home environment was deliberately structured to allow periods where she could simply be human, with ordinary preferences, contradictions, limitations, and complexity that wouldn't be evaluated for their symbolic significance. "In here," she once remarked, while relaxing with friends during a rare evening without obligation, "I don't have to be excellent or representative or inspirational. I can just be Simone, messy and ordinary and unfinished. That freedom isn't a luxury, it's a necessity for survival." This crystallized something fundamental about the courage I was witnessing daily. Simone's bravery wasn't primarily about performing danger or handling competitive pressure. Impressives were. Her deepest courage was maintaining her humanity and authenticity amid relentless pressure to become a simplified symbol, insisting on her right to complexity in a world determined to flatten her into whatever representation it needed her to be. 7 months in my role, I understood that Simone wasn't navigating just the physical risks of elite gymnastics, but the existential of losing herself amid others' projections and expectations. The fear she faced daily wasn't primarily about physical safety, but about the potential dissolution of authentic selfhood under the weight of representational demands. And her response to this fear wasn't avoidance or capitulation, but a disciplined practice of discernment, carefully distinguishing between responsibilities she could authentically embrace and burdens she needed to respectfully decline. This wasn't simplistic authenticity that disregarded community obligations. It was sophisticated integrity that honored both collective needs and personal truth. In this daily practice, I witnessed a form of courage rarely acknowledged in public narrative about Simone Biles, the courage to insist on being fully human when the world preferred her to be a symbol, and the wisdom to navigate representational responsibilities without being reduced to them. Chapter 6. The Body's Wisdom. 8 months into my position, a revealing incident illuminated another dimension of Simone's relationship with fear, one that contradicted conventional narratives about athletic courage and physical limitation. The situation arose during what staff called a body mapping session, a specialized practice with Simone's somatic therapist that occurred bi-weekly in a dedicated space within the home. My involvement was peripheral, ensuring the environment was prepared according to specific requirements and that no interruptions occurred during the session. On this particular day, however, A delivery requiring Simone's immediate signature arrived during the session. After confirming the urgency with her management, I reluctantly interrupted, knocking softly before entering with appropriate apologies. What I witnessed in that brief moment transformed my understanding of Simone's approach to physical awareness and courage. Rather than the typical strength training or flexibility work I might have expected, Simone was engaged in a practice focused on subtle sensation, lying quietly on a mat while her therapist guided her attention to minute signals from different parts of her body. After signing the document, and as I turned to leave, Simone unexpectedly addressed me. "This probably looks strange compared to what people imagine a gymnast's physical work involves," she said with a slight smile, seeming to recognize my poorly concealed curiosity. "It does seem different from typical athletic training. That's because it's the opposite of what I was taught for most of my career. In elite gymnastics, you're trained to override your body's signal, to push through pain, to ignore warnings, to treat the body as something to be conquered rather than listened." Her therapist nodded in agreement. "We're working to restore communication channels that intensive training often disrupts, helping Simone recognize and respond to her body's intelligence rather than suppress it." This brief exchange hinted at a perspective fundamentally different from conventional athletic narratives about physical courage. In the weeks that followed, I observed how this approach integrated into Simone's daily practice, revealing a sophisticated relationship with physical limits and bodily wisdom. The clearest illustration came during a week when Simone was preparing for a significant competitive event. While conventional preparation might have emphasized pushing physically harder, I observed something more nuanced. A careful attention to subtle bodily feedback and an integration of this information into training. During a home review session with her coach and performance, Simone described sensation in her right shoulder that would have been easy to dismiss as routine training discomfort. Rather than minimizing these signals or pushing through them, the team engaged in a detailed exploration, adjusting training elements based on this bodily feedback while Simone maintained her competitive preparation. Before Tokyo, I would have ignored this. I overheard her tell her physical therapist. I was conditioned to treat my body as something separate from me, a tool to be controlled rather than a system with its own intelligence. That approach led to disconnection that manifested as the twisty. This perspective illuminated a form of courage dramatically different from the stereotypical athletic bravery of overriding physical limitation. Simone was describing the courage to listen to her body's wisdom, to respect its communications even when external pressures demanded she ignore them, to trust its signals even when competitive goals seemed to require overriding them. Most revealing was a conversation between Simone and a young gymnast who had come to the house for mentor. The younger athlete was describing how she pushed through pain, presenting this as evidence of dedication and mental toughness. Simone's response was gentle but direct. "There's nothing brave about ignoring your body's intelligence," she told the young gymnast. "I learned that lesson the hard way. Real courage is developing the capacity to listen to what your body is communicating and respond wisely. Sometimes that means pushing, but often it means adjusting or resting." She continued, offering perspective rarely heard in elite sports context. "Pain isn't weakness leaving the body. That's a danger. Pain is information your body is providing about what's happening. Sometimes working through discomfort is appropriate, but ignoring clear warning signals isn't courage, it's disconnection." This philosophy extended beyond training to Simone's overall relationship with her body. I observed regular practice designed specifically to strengthen body awareness and connection, not just physical sensitivity, but the capacity to interpret and respond appropriately to bodily signals across various situations. Most significant was how this approach influenced Simone's definition of physical courage. During a podcast recording conducted from her home studio, I overheard her articulate this perspective. "People associate courage with ignoring fear, pushing through pain, overriding limits. But I've learned that real physical courage often looks like the opposite, having the wisdom to respect what your body is telling you, especially when external pressures demand you ignore it." She continued with insight that directly challenged conventional athletic narratives. "In Tokyo, stepping back wasn't a failure of courage. It was an act of courage. It required trusting my body's signals when everyone expected me to override them. That's much harder than pushing through would have been." This perspective revealed something profound about how Simone had reconstructed her understanding of physical courage after the Tokyo experience. Rather than defining bravery as the capacity to suppress or overcome bodily signal, she had developed a more sophisticated one that integrated bodily wisdom into a broader understanding of courageous action. 9 months into my position, I recognized that this perspective represented a revolutionary shift within elite sports culture. Where traditional athletic environments often celebrated the courage to override physical limitations, Simone was modeling the courage to respect bodily intelligence, to integrate its wisdom rather than conquer its limitation. Most importantly, this wasn't a retreat from excellence or competitive achievement, but a more sophisticated path towards sustainable performance. Simone wasn't abandoning the pursuit of extraordinary physical feats. She was approaching them with greater body-mind integration, allowing her remarkable capabilities to emerge through connection rather than conquest. This revealed yet another dimension of the courage Simone practiced daily. Not the stereotypical athletic courage of battling against physical limitation, but the more nuanced bravery of honoring her body's wisdom even when external expectations and competitive pressures demanded she silence. And in a cultural context that still largely celebrated athletes for their willingness to sacrifice physical well-being for achievement, this quiet insistence on bodily respect represented a form of courage that few recognized, but that potentially held transformative implications for sports culture more broadly. Chapter 7. The Public-Private Divide. 10 months into managing Simone's household, I witnessed an aspect of her daily reality that few outside her inner circle ever glimpsed: the extraordinary psychological discipline required to navigate the divide between her public and private selves. This dimension became visible during preparations for a major media appearance, a high-profile interview that would reach millions of viewers and inevitably touch on sensitive aspects of her career, including the Tokyo Olympics and her advocacy around mental health and abuse. The preparation process was far more complex than I had imagined. It began 3 days before the actual interview with what Simone called boundary mapping, a structured session with her communications director and psychologist where they collaboratively identified which aspects of her experience she was willing to discuss publicly, which required careful framing, and which remained completely private. Most revealing was the sophisticated framework Simone applied to the decision. This wasn't simply about avoiding uncomfortable topics, it reflected a deeply considered philosophy about public vulnerability, personal dignity, and responsible representation. She distinguished between sharing personal challenges in ways that might help others and performing vulnerability as entertainment or brand building. There's a difference between controlled vulnerability that serves a purpose beyond myself and exploitation that converts my struggles into content, I overheard her explain during the preparations. I'm willing to discuss the twisty because that transparency helps other athletes, but certain aspects of my healing journey remain private because making them public would change their nature in ways that could disrupt that healing. This careful discernment extended beyond the interview content to the persona Simone would present. I observed as she worked with her team to identify which aspects of her authentic self could be safely expressed in the public sphere and which required protection, external consumption, and potential. The Simone peep on camera isn't fake, explained when she noticed observation of this process. She's real, but she's not. She's the part of me that can engage with public attention without being damaged by it. This comment illuminated something fundamental about the courage required to navigate fame of Simone's magnitude. The challenge wasn't simply handling public scrutiny. It was maintaining psychological integration while presenting a necessarily partial version of herself to the world. Being authentic without being completely exposed, transparent without being unprotected. The day of the interview itself revealed the discipline this navigation required. I observed as Simone moved through a specific preparation sequence, not just physical styling, but psychological and energetic preparation for the transition from private to public self. This wasn't about becoming artificial, but about consciously choosing which aspects of her authentic experience could safely engage with the public. Most striking was the moment immediately after the interview concluded and the cameras stopped rolling. Simone maintained her public persona through the goodbyes and until she reached the privacy of her car. Only then did I witness a subtle but significant, a release of certain expressive, a return to more natural speech pattern, a physical softening that signaled the transition back to her private. The toll of these transitions apparent later that evening. When we returned to the residence, Simone went directly to what staff called the decompression, a space specifically designed for processing the psychological effects of public engagement. Her performance psychologist arrived shortly afterward for what I learned was a standard post-exposure integration. While I wasn't privy to the specifics of this session, a brief interaction afterward revealed its purpose. When I delivered some requested items to Simone following the session, she appeared noticeably more grounded than upon our return. The hardest part isn't the interview itself, she commented, noticing my observation of this shift. It's the psychological transition between public and private selves. Without proper integration, those selves can start to feel disconnected from each other. That fragmentation is the real danger of public life. This insight illuminated a form of courage I had never previously recognized. The courage required to maintain psychological integrity while necessarily presenting a partial self publicly. Simone wasn't just managing her image, she was actively working to prevent the kind of identity fragmentation that has damaged many public figures. In the weeks that followed, I became more attuned to the disciplined practice that supported this integration. Simone maintained specific rituals for transition between public and private context. She engaged in regular reflection about maintaining authenticity without harmful exposure. She worked with her psychological team to ensure that her public self remained connected to her complete experience, rather than developing to a separate, performative identity. Perhaps most significant was how Simone protected certain aspects of her life from any public engagement. These weren't necessarily secret or aspects she was ashamed of. Often, they were deeply meaningful experiences that she recognized would be fundamentally altered if exposed to public consumption. Some things change their nature when observed externally, she explained during a rare direct conversation about this boundary work. Certain experiences, relationships, and aspects of identity need protection not because they're shameful, but because their meaning exists in privacy. Making them public wouldn't just share them, it would transform them into something else. This perspective revealed sophisticated understanding of how public attention affects personal experience, how external observation can change the nature of what it observes, particularly in contexts of celebrity, where that observation is filtered through pre-existing narratives and expectations. 11 months into my position, I recognized that this boundary work represented one of the most demanding aspects of Simone's daily courage. The challenge wasn't simply handling fame's practical imposition, but maintaining psychological wholeness while necessarily presenting a partial self to the world, being authentically present in public context without sacrificing the integrity of her complete experience. Most revealing was how this understanding informed Simone's social media presence, a carefully considered aspect of her public engagement that balanced authentic connection with necessary boundary. Unlike many celebrities who either overshare in the name of authenticity or present highly curated artificial images, Simone had developed a nuanced approach that offered genuine connection while maintaining crucial psychological protection. Social media creates the illusion that complete transparency equals authenticity, she once explained, while reviewing content with her digital. But true authenticity includes respecting the parts of yourself that aren't meant for public consumption. The challenge is being genuine about what you do share, while honoring what you don't. This philosophy manifested in content that felt natural and unforced, but was actually the result of thoughtful consideration about what aspects of her experience could engage healthily with public attention and which required protection. This wasn't manipulation, but mature discernment about the complex relationship between visibility and psychological well-being. Through these observations, I came to understand that Simone wasn't simply managing fame's practical challenge. She was engaged in the sophisticated psychological work of maintaining internal integration while navigating the necessarily partial presentation of self that public life required. And this revealed yet another dimension of the courage she practiced daily, not just the physical bravery that defined her athletic achievements or the moral courage of her advocacy work, but the psychological courage to maintain wholeness in a context specifically designed to fragment the self into consumable pieces. This wasn't the spectacular courage that made headlines. It was the quiet, daily bravery of protecting one's essential humanity while engaging with systems that constantly threatened to reduce that humanity to content, symbol, or projection. And it required constant practice, unwavering discipline, and sophisticated support structures largely invisible to the public that benefited from her presence. Chapter 8. The Integration Practice. By my 11th month in Simone's household, I had observed various dimensions of her relationship with fear, from the morning protocol addressing specific fears to her navigation of the twisty, from handling representational burdens to maintaining boundaries between public and private selves. What I hadn't yet fully understood was how these separate elements connected within a unified approach to living courageously amid extraordinary pressures. This understanding came through witnessing what staff simply called integration practice, a weekly session with Simone's lead performance psychologist that synthesized insights from various domains into a coherent framework for psychological function. My perspective on this practice came unexpected. A scheduling conflict required moving the session to a different space within the residence, one where I was completing organizational work nearby. While I maintained appropriate distance and focus on my responsibilities, the open design of the space made certain aspects of the conversation unavoidable to overhear. What I witnessed was not traditional sports psychology or therapeutic intervention, but something more sophisticated, a collaborative exploration of how Simone's various experiences and practice connected within an overall approach to navigating fear and pressure across all domains of life. The session began with what they called a system review, examining how different aspects of Simone's life were functioning and interacting. This wasn't compartmentalized into separate categories like gymnastics and personal life, but approached as an integrated system where each domain influenced and reflected the others. The training breakthrough this week reflects the boundary work we've been doing in public context, the psychologist observed, making connections I wouldn't have recognized. The same capacity to maintain presence amid external pressure is expressing itself in both domains. Simone nodded thoughtfully. I noticed that connection, the technique we developed for media interaction, focusing on internal reference points rather than external reaction, translated directly to maintaining spatial awareness during complex elements. This exchange illuminated something fundamental about Simone's approach to courage. It wasn't domain-specific, but reflected an integrated philosophy applied across different contexts. The same principles that guided her approach to gymnastics informed how she navigated public scrutiny, representational burdens, and interpersonal boundaries. Most revealing was their discussion of what they called fear integration, an approach dramatically different from conventional notions of overcoming fear. Rather than treating fear as an obstacle to be conquered, they discussed it as information to be incorporated into a comprehensive understanding of any situation. The training setback yesterday, where are you locating that in the framework? The psychologist. Initially, quadrant 3, Simone replied, referencing what appeared to be a shared conceptual model. Fear arising from legitimate risk, requiring technical adjustment rather than psychological work. But after reflection, I recognized elements of quadrant 1 as well. Echoes of old performance narratives that needed separate addressing. This exchange revealed a sophisticated taxonomy of fear, distinguishing between different types based on source, function, and appropriate response, rather than treating all fear as a uniform experience requiring a single approach. Some fears signaled legitimate physical danger requiring technical adjustment. Others reflected conditioned trauma responses needing psychological process. Still, others emerged from social expectations or anticipated judgment. The key insight wasn't just this categorization, but how it informed response. Different types of fear required different approaches. Some needed respectful attention and specific technical modification. Others benefited from exposure and recalibration, while still others called for boundary set or meaning-making intervention. The framework keeps evolving, the psychologist noted at one point. How are you finding the latest adjustment? More integrated, Simone replied. Earlier versions still treated physical and psychological domains as separate systems. This approach recognizes how completely they reflect and influence each other. The body expresses psychological patterns. Mental states manifest physically. It's one integrated system rather than parallel process. This perspective illuminated how Simone had developed beyond conventional sports psychology approaches that often treat physical and mental domains as separate training tracks. Her framework recognized the complete integration of these aspects, how bodily experiences influenced psychological states and how mental patterns manifested in physical performance. Most significant was their discussion of what they called sustainable courage, distinguishing between approaches that might produce short-term results but create long-term damage and those that supported ongoing psychological health alongside performance. The old model was extraction-based, Simone observed. Extract maximum performance regardless of psychological cost, then deal with consequences later, if ever. We're building something different, a regenerative approach where performance emerges from well-being rather than sacrifice. This philosophy directly challenged traditional athletic narratives that celebrate performance at any cost. Simone was describing an approach where extraordinary achievement wasn't purchased through psychological damage, but emerged from integrated well-being, where the means of achieving excellence aligned with sustainable human flourishing rather than undermining it. The session concluded with what they called practice alignment, ensuring that Simone's daily practices across different domains reflected this integrated philosophy rather than working at cross purposes. This wasn't just about training elements, but encompassed media engagement, business decisions, relationship boundaries, and psychological self-care, all approached as aspects of a single, coherent system rather than separate compartments. In the weeks that followed, I observed how this integrated framework manifests in Simone's daily choice and responses. When facing challenges, whether in training, public appearances, or personal relationships, she applied a consistent philosophical approach rather than shifting between disconnected strategies for different domains. Most revealing was how this integration influenced decision-making processes. When evaluating opportunities or addressing difficulties, Simone considered not just practical factors, but alignment with her overall approach to courage, authenticity, and sustainable engagement with pressure. 12 months into my position, I recognized that what made Simone's approach to fear remarkable wasn't any single technique or perspective, but the sophisticated integration of multiple dimensions into a coherent whole. She hadn't developed separate strategies for handling competitive pressure, public scrutiny, representational burdens, and personal challenges. She had created a unified framework that addressed fear as a multidimensional but fundamentally integrated aspect of human experience. This wasn't compartmentalized courage, physical bravery in gymnastics, moral courage in advocacy, psychological courage in public life. It was an integrated approach to living courageously across all domains, based on sophisticated understanding of how fear functions as both warning signal and growth opportunity, both protection mechanism and potential limitation. And most importantly, this framework wasn't focused on eliminating fear, but on developing a wise relationship, recognizing its various manifestations, understanding its different functions, and responding with approaches matched to specific types rather than a one-size-fits-all strategy of putting through or overcoming. This integrated approach represented perhaps the most significant dimension of what Simone had developed in her quest to live courageously. Not just techniques for handling specific fears, but a comprehensive philosophy for engaging with fear as an inevitable and potentially valuable aspect of a fully human life. Chapter 9. The Relational Courage. As my year managing Simone's household approached its conclusion, I witnessed a dimension of her courage that received little public attention but fundamentally shaped her approach to fear and pressure. The courage required to maintain authentic relationships amid extraordinary fame and the specific practices she had developed to sustain them. This aspect became visible through what staff called connection protocol, structured approaches to ensuring that relationships remained grounded in mutual authenticity rather than distorted by Simone's public status. These weren't casual preferences, but carefully developed practice designed to address specific challenges that fame posed to genuine human connection. My first clear glimpse of these protocols came during preparations for a visit from Simone's closest friends, women she had known since childhood, before her international fame. I observed specific arrangements that initially seemed like simple hospitality, but revealed themselves as sophisticated approaches to relationship maintenance. Most notable was the creation of what Simone called normal space, environments specifically designed to minimize the impact of her public status on interpersonal dynamics. This included physical settings where celebrity indicators were absent, activities that emphasized shared humanity rather than status difference, and interaction structures that redistributed attention and authority among all participants rather than centralizing it on some. When I commented on the thoughtfulness of these arrangements, Simone provided insight that revealed their deeper purpose. Fame creates a gravitational distortion in relationships, she explained. Everything wants to orbit around the famous person. Conversation, attention, decision-making, even emotional experience. These structures aren't just preference, they're deliberate countermeasures against forces that would otherwise make authentic connection impossible. This perspective illuminated a form of courage I hadn't previously recognized, the courage to resist the intoxicating centrality that fame naturally creates and, instead, do the more difficult work of creating conditions where genuine mutuality remained possible. Most revealing was observing these dynamics in practice during the friend visit. Simone employed specific conversational approaches that skillfully redirected attention when it became too focused on her experiences, created space for others to lead interaction, and maintained awareness of subtle power dynamics that might otherwise go unnoticed. These weren't manipulative techniques, but thoughtful practices designed to counteract the natural distortion that extreme status difference create in human. The goal wasn't pretending fame didn't exist, but preventing it from overwhelming the possibility of authentic relationship. The greatest threat fame poses isn't to privacy, but to mutuality, Simone explained after the visit, when we were reviewing upcoming social engagement. People naturally shift into audience mode around famous individuals, relating to the public persona rather than the actual person. Resisting that pattern requires deliberate practice from both sides. This insight revealed something profound about the courage Simone applied to relationships. The threat wasn't primarily external exposure, but internal distortion. the subtle transformation of authentic human connection into performance and spectatorship, even with people who genuinely cared about her welfare. The sophistication of Simone's approach became even clearer through her relationship with newer acquaintances, people who had entered her life after her rise to international fame. Here, I observed specific practice designed to accelerate the transition from public persona to authentic connection through what she called calibrated vulnerability. With new relationships, the challenge is creating pathways past the public image without excessive vulnerability that might be unsafe, she explained when I inquired about these practices. It requires carefully chosen moments of authentic disclosure that invite reciprocal openness without creating exposure I'm not prepared to handle. This balanced approach, neither maintaining impenetrable walls nor engaging in reckless openness, reflected a sophisticated understanding of the courage required. Simone wasn't avoiding vulnerability, but applying it with discernment, recognizing that authentic connection required openness while also acknowledging the legitimate risks her public position created. Perhaps most significant was how these relational practices connected to Simone's overall approach to fear. Just as she had developed nuanced perspectives on physical and psychological fears, she had created sophisticated frameworks for navigating the specific fears that accompanied relationships in the context of extreme fame. Fears of exploitation, projection, hidden agendas, and the subtle transformation of authentic connection into consumption or performance. This connection became explicit during a conversation with her performance psychologist that I overheard during schedule coordination. They were discussing transfer effects between different domains, how practices developed in one area influenced functioning in others. The same courage that allows you to navigate physical risk in gymnastics appears in how you handle relational vulnerability, the psychologist observed. In both domains, you've developed the capacity to distinguish between productive discomfort that leads to growth and warning signals indicate potential harm. Simone nodded in agreement. Both require staying present with uncertainty rather than seeking premature resolution. In gymnastics, that means maintaining awareness during complex elements, even when that awareness includes fear. In relationship, it means remaining open to authentic connection, even when that openness involves risk. This parallel illuminated something fundamental about Simone's integrated approach to courage. The same principles she applied to physical challenges in gymnastics and psychological pressures in public life extended to her approach to relationships, not eliminating fear, but developing the capacity to function effectively alongside it, distinguishing between different types of fear and matching responses appropriately to each. Most revealing was how these relational practices influenced Simone's ability to navigate public pressure. I observed that following periods of authentic connection with close friends and family, she demonstrated greater resilience when facing external demands and expectations. These relationships weren't just personal preference, but essential components of her overall capacity to face fear across all authentic connections. The foundation explained during a rare direct conversation about these patterns. Without relationships where I'm valued for my humanity rather than my performance or representation, I lose my internal reference point. Everything becomes about external metrics and others' projection. This perspective revealed the essential role that relational courage played in its overall approach to living courageously. Maintaining authentic relationships wasn't separate from handling competitive pressure or public scrutiny. It was the foundation that made those other forms of courage possible by preserving access to her authentic self amid forces that constantly threatened to reduce her to symbol, commodity, or performance. As my year with the household concluded, I recognized that this relational dimension represented one of the most significant aspects of the courage Simone practiced daily. Not the spectacular bravery of athletic feats or public advocacy, but the quieter courage of remaining authentically connected to others despite forces specifically designed to distort those connections. And this wasn't incidental to her capacity to face other fears. It was essential infrastructure that supported courage across all domains. By maintaining relationships grounded in authentic humanity rather than performance or status, Simone preserved access to her core self, the reference that allowed her to navigate other pressures without becoming defined by external expectations or others' projections. This revealed perhaps the most fundamental insight about the courage Simone practiced daily, that true bravery wasn't isolated individual achievement, but emerged through connection to herself, to others, to larger purpose. The courage to perform extraordinary physical feats, to withstand intense public scrutiny, and to advocate for important causes all rested on the more fundamental courage to remain authentically connected in a context that constantly threatened to transform genuine relationship into performance and consumption. Chapter 10. the understanding. In my final week managing Simone's household, an unexpected situation provided the perfect culmination to my year of observation, bringing into focus the essential nature of the courage she practiced daily. A documentary crew had arrived to film segments for a retrospective on Simone's career, focusing particularly on her decisions in Tokyo and subsequent return to competition. As part of my responsibilities, I was coordinating logistics for this project, ensuring minimal disruption to Simone's training and personal routines. On the second day of filming, a young production assistant accidentally entered a private area of the residence during what staff call Simone's restoration time, a protected period specifically designed for psychological recovery and integration. This breach of protocol would typically result in immediate correction, but what happened instead provided remarkable. Rather than displaying frustration, Simone engaged the apologetic assistant in conversation, curious about her perspective on the documentary project. This unplanned interaction led to a dialogue that illuminated the core of Simone's approach to courage more clearly than any scheduled interview could have captured. "What story do you think we're telling here?" Simone asked the genuinely interested. "Your journey from setback to comeback," the young woman, clearly referencing Tokyo and Simone's subsequent return. "How you faced and overcame it again." Simone considered that that's the typical narrative. Fear as obstacle, courage as conquest. But that framework missily happened. What followed was a remarkably candid exp of how Simone had reconstructed her understanding of fear and courage through her experience, perspectives rarely captured in media narrative. The story isn't about overcoming fear to return to competition. It's about developing a different relationship with fear altogether. Recognize it as intelligence rather than weakness, information rather than obstacle. She continued, articulating with remarkable clarity the philosophy I had observed in practice throughout the year. Before Tokyo, I operated from the conventional understanding. Courage meant pushing through fear, overriding warning signals, performing despite internal resistance. That approach led directly to the twisty and withdrawal from competition. The real transformation wasn't finding the courage to compete again. It was developing a more sophisticated understanding of what courage actually is. Not the absence or conquest of fear, but the capacity to remain present with fear, listen to its intelligence, and respond wisely rather than reactively. This perspective directly challenged the simplistic narratives typically applied to athletic comeback, which framed them as stories of overcoming fear through determination and mental toughness. Simone was describing something fundamentally different, not conquering fear, but transforming her relationship with it through deeper understanding of its various forms and functions. Real courage isn't ignoring warning signals, but developing the discernment to interpret them correctly, distinguishing between fears that protect us from legitimate danger and those that merely preserve comfort or reinforce limitation. The young assistant seemed genuinely moved by this perspective. "That's not the story we're telling in the documentary," she admitted. "It rarely is," Simone replied without resentment. "The overcoming fear narrative is simpler, more dramatic, fits existing cultural beliefs about what courage looks like. The reality that courage is often quiet discernment rather than dramatic conquest doesn't make for easy storytelling." This exchange illuminated what I had been observing throughout my year in Simone's household, that her approach to fear represented a fundamental reconceptualization of courage itself, one that contradicted dominant cultural narratives but offered a more sustainable, sophisticated alternative. Later that day, as I finalized arrangements for the crew's final session, Simone commented further on the interaction. "That's the challenge with these projects. They inevitably simplify complex reality to familiar storyline. The nuance gets lost, and with it, the opportunity for deeper understanding." This observation captured something essential about why Simone's actual approach to courage remained largely invisible in public narrative. The practices I had witnessed throughout the year, the morning protocol addressing specific fears, the sophisticated response to the twisty, the careful navigation of representational burdens, the boundary work between public and private selves, the integration practice connecting different domains, the relational courage sustaining authentic connection. These didn't fit neatly into established narratives about athletic heroism or personal transformation. These practices represented a fundamentally different paradigm, one where courage wasn't about fearlessness or conquest, but about developing sophisticated relationships with fear across all its manifestations. This approach recognized fear as a multidimensional experience requiring nuanced response rather than uniform opposition, sometimes heeding its wisdom, sometimes gently setting it aside, always engaging with it respectfully rather than dismissively. On my final day, as I completed the transition of my responsibilities, Simone asked about my own professional plans. When I mentioned potential research work in sports psychology, she offered a perspective that encapsulated everything I had observed. The field needs new frameworks around fear and performance. The old models, mental toughness, pushing through fear, overcoming limits, create as many problems as they solve. They frame the body and mind as adversary rather than integrated aspects of one system. They treat fear as uniform weakness rather than complex information. They celebrate performance at any cost without considering long-term sustainability. Continued, articulating what I had come to recognize as the core of her philosophy. Real courage isn't about the absence of fear or even mastery. It's about presence with fear, the capacity to remain fully engaged with experience even when that experience includes fear. It's about maintaining access to choice rather than becoming reactive, being able to respond wisely to fear rather than being driven by it or battling against it. This perspective illuminated the essential nature of the courage I had witnessed Simone practice daily. Not the spectacular bravery that made headlines, but a quieter, more sustainable courage centered on presence, discernment, and wise response rather than conquest or denial. As I prepared to depart, Simone offered a final reflection that perfectly captured the understanding I had gained. Courage isn't a quality some people have and others don't. It's a practice available to everyone, the practice of remaining present with reality exactly as it is, including the difficult parts, and responding from wisdom rather than reaction. The gymnast part of my life gets all the attention, she added, but the real work happens in these unseen practices, learning to stay present with fear without being controlled by, developing discernment about different types of fear and appropriate responses to each, creating conditions where wisdom can emerge from challenge rather than being overwhelmed. Driving away from the residence for the final time, I reflected on what I had been privileged to witness throughout the year. The Simone Biles known to the public was remarkable for her physical achievements, her advocacy work, and her willingness to prioritize mental health on the world's largest stage. But the Simone Biles I had observed daily was even more remarkable for something largely invisible to external, the sophisticated practice she had developed for living courageously amid extraordinary pressure. These weren't the dramatic acts of bravery that made headlines, but quiet daily discipline. The morning protocol addressing specific fears, the consistent integration, work connecting different domains of experience, the boundary practice protecting authentic selfhood amid public demands, the relational courage maintaining genuine connection despite fame's distortion. Together, these practices represented not just techniques for handling pressure, but a comprehensive philosophy of courage, one that recognized fear not as weakness to be overcome, but as complex information to be engaged with wisely. This wasn't the absence of fear, but the presence of sophisticated relationship with it, understanding its various forms, interpreting its different signals, and responding with approaches matched specific manifestations rather than uniform opposition. And perhaps most significantly, this courage wasn't primarily about athleticism at all. The same principles Simone applied to navigating physical risk in gymnastics extended to all domains of her life. Handling public scrutiny, managing representational burdens, maintaining authentic relationships, protecting psychological integrity amid external pressure to become symbol, commodity, or projection. What I had witnessed wasn't an athlete who had conquered fear, but a human being who had developed a more sophisticated understanding of, recognizing that true courage wasn't found in fearlessness, but in the capacity to remain fully present and responsive, even when fear was part of that presence. This wasn't the story told in documentaries or celebrated in public narratives, but it represented a profound contribution to our understanding of courage, not as dramatic conquest, but as sustained practice, not as absence of fear, but as wise engagement, not as individual achievement, but as relational capacity embedded in larger contexts of meaning and purpose. In this quiet daily practice, largely invisible to public view, but more demanding than any athletic feat, lay the true courage of Simone Biles. Not the courage to perform extraordinary skills, impressive though they were, but the courage to remain fully human amid extraordinary pressures specifically designed to make her something less and something more than human. And in that practice lay wisdom, not just for athletes or public figures, but for anyone seeking to live with greater courage amid life's inevitable fears and pressures, not by eliminating fear or battling against it, but by developing a wiser relationship with it as an integral aspect